Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series. This is not a series on postmodernism. In this video we're going to be looking at what is postmodern philosophy of truth. Now, with that we move on to a critique of another essential concept in philosophy, truth. For this we're going to draw on the works of Alfred Tarski, Kurt Gödel, and Jean-François Lyotard. Tarski offers a deductive mathematical proof that truth is undefinable. The proof is quite technical, but if you're interested in a full, very detailed explanation, check out our series on Alfred Tarski's theory of truth. The simple conclusion of Tarski's proof is that you cannot define truth for a sufficiently complex language within that language itself. The only way you can define truth in a language is by using a meta-language. But you can't define truth for that meta-language, only for the object language, the language it's referring to. To define truth for the meta-language, you need a meta-meta-language, and so on. You can never define truth for a language within that language itself. It is mathematically impossible. Gödel's incompleteness theorems show a parallel conclusion, that the set of claims you can prove in any given language that's sufficiently complex is always less than the set of claims that are true in that language. You can never prove all true statements. In other words, there will always be statements in any sufficiently complex language that are true but unprovable. And also, the converse is true, that there will always be statements that are false that cannot be proven false. This is problematic for the modernist conception that we are discovering truths and that we can eventually discover everything that is true, since not only does it show that discovering at least one fact, what truth is for our language, is mathematically impossible, but it also shows that there will always be unprovable truths and questions the very idea of discovering any true facts, given that truth itself cannot be defined. It corresponds to the ideas of paradigms and language games that we have to use a meta-language, a paradigm, meta-narrative, what have you, to define truth within a given object language. But we cannot use that definition on the meta-language itself. Paradigms are therefore incommensurable. We can't tell if a paradigm is true because we can't apply that definition of truth to that paradigm itself. We need to go up a level in the hierarchy. But once we go up a level in the hierarchy, that language itself can't be defined as true. And so we have a bit of an infinite regress. In other words, something can only be true based on a definition from a meta-language, not objectively true based on a definition of truth within that object language itself. As with Kuhn's paradigms or Wittgenstein's language games, this shows we can prove things locally, given a particular language game, given a particular paradigm, given a particular meta-language definition of truth. But we cannot validate that this is the right paradigm, the right language game, or the right definition of truth. Gödel's proofs are also problematic for the positivist project of proving everything that is true using verification. If everything that is meaningful can be verified, then there are no truths that are not provable. Gödel shows that for any language that is sufficiently complex, there are truths that are inherently unprovable, but meaningful. We'll never be able to prove everything that is true, even in the very deductive field of mathematics, let alone in more complex fields like even the hard sciences, let alone the social sciences. We cannot prove everything that is true. There will always be truths that we cannot prove. Now, moving across the analytic continental divide, Lyotard also has concerns about truth. However, his are much more focused on the postmodern loss of a single meta-narrative which ties together the processes for attaining truth in various disciplines. So you think that various disciplines have different methodologies that they use. Science has the scientific method. You have particular methods in statistics which give you different levels of certainty epistemically, all of these things. You have different methods in different disciplines for attaining truth. In theory, those disciplines should be connected back to truth through philosophy. Philosophy is the glue that holds all of these disciplines together, and in many ways was the discipline that started them off. Check out my video on the map of philosophy if you want more on kind of that framing of philosophy. But what's going on here is, according to Lyotard, philosophy has lost some of that power. Philosophy has lost some of that ability to connect these disciplines back to that idea of truth. These disciplines, such as science, have gone off on their own, expanded the scientific method beyond the limits of what philosophy of science would say they can legitimately claim is a justified claim. You imagine something like cosmology is a great example of this. And so you have all of these disciplines that are moving forward with changing their paradigms and changing their methodologies without an important connection back to philosophy. And it means that those different disciplines, even within science, might be drawing different conclusions. If they're functioning within different scientific paradigms, they may be drawing contradictory conclusions, as we saw when we were talking about Kuhn. And there's no way to resolve those disagreements because those paradigms are incommensurable. Basically, as various academic disciplines diverge and create their own standards for determining if something is true, it's possible that those definitions could conflict. Without a philosophical meta-narrative of epistemology, justification, truth, to connect them, we end up with a pluralistic worldview, where claims that are true in one discipline may be false in another. Without an overarching meta-narrative to evaluate and compare the claims of different disciplines, a role that has historically been filled by philosophy, claims of disciplines are incommensurable. This is why you have conversations in science and religion speaking past each other, because they've forgotten their roots in philosophy, because they can't go back down to a logical argument, to a means of narrative communication that can actually speak to each other. They are at a level where their disciplines have become disconnected. They become incommensurable. And so they talk past each other and hold different beliefs and claims because they no longer have that basis that they can argue about and find what is the difference in their actual logical frameworks. They're unable to have a real argument and just end up yelling past each other. Practically, this means that science and religion, politics and morality, art and economics talk past each other because there's no common arbiter of truth to decide between them. Or those disciplines have just been disconnected from that traditional arbiter of truth in philosophy. Lyotard places the blame for this separation at the feet of science, which has become separate from its own epistemic underpinnings and from the bounds allowed it by the philosophy of science. Science plays the language game of denotation, while ignoring the fact that the scientific method itself is underpinned by narrative, in other words, philosophical arguments. This is very similar to some of the problems with positivists that we saw both when we were talking about Kuhn, but just generally with logical positivists. The idea that if you have some scientific principle that something is only meaningful if it's verifiable out in the world, that methodology and that principle itself is not verifiable out in the world, is not justifiable out in the world, must be justified narratively, must be justified through, in this case, philosophy and philosophy of science. And so if you have this belief that science will answer all the questions, the problem is the claim that science will answer all the questions can't be proved by science. It has to be proved narratively. It has to be proved by philosophy. And so when science disconnects itself from philosophy, it loses that connection to and any ability to prove true the very method that it's using. By divorcing itself from these underpinnings, science has lost the ability to communicate or connect with the disciplines that underpin it, and it has led to science fracturing off and being able to draw different conclusions in different disciplines that are using different paradigms, leading to potentially invalid science, such as unfalsifiable cosmology. Watch my videos on the cosmic fine-tuning argument for some of my issues with cosmology, being equated with science that is on much more firmer epistemic footing because it's lost that connection to philosophy of science that is saying, you know what, these things are science. You're doing physics, you're doing chemistry, that looks like science. You're off here doing cosmology, maybe that's not science. Lyotard goes further, arguing that attempts to create consensus between disciplines and argue for a single truth are outdated. Such attempts at consensus inevitably lead to a particular viewpoint dominating, not because it's objectively right, but because it's backed by those with power. This once again gets into kind of the post-structuralist narrative. Lyotard laments the death of modernism, not because he thinks postmodernism is ethically good, but because he thinks that it's simply a fact of life. It is something that has happened to our academic discourse. It has become disconnected. Different disciplines have moved into different paradigms that may conflict with each other without the ability to settle those disagreements. He's not saying that that's a good thing, yay, that we've lost kind of this ability to go back to a reasoned or rational argument. Rather, he's saying that's what's happened. We just need to deal with it. Now, to take a step back and take a look at some objections to these positions. So objection to Tarski or Gödel's proof short of doubting logic itself, which the modernist is going to be particularly averse to, as we'll see in a moment, is impossible. That said, one might claim that such formal proofs lack the bearing on modern discourse that some postmodernists might claim that they do. The modernists might soften their claim to say that we're searching for all provable statements in a system, not necessarily all true ones, or all of those that are true. We don't really need to get all of those, complicated statements that are reframings of the liar paradox. You know what? We can toss those out. That's not really what we're talking about. These proofs are talking about very, very specific claims, and we don't need those. Really, we're talking about making progress towards all the provable claims, or claim that informal definitions of truth or informal languages are sufficient for what we're talking about. We don't need a perfectly rigorous definition of truth. It's going to be challenging to define statements as objectively true or false without that definition, but one might make the case that, these informal languages are sufficient. However, both of these proofs constitute substantial weakening of kind of the modernist position that we're going towards a world, or the positivist position that we're going towards a world where we are going to know everything, we're going to have everything proved, and we're not going to need to kind of be looking for new things or discovering new things. Because according to Gödel and Tarski, we can't prove everything, and we're never going to have a perfect definition of truth. Lyotard's claims are more expansive and therefore admit of more possible objections. One might argue that simply because disciplines fail to utilize the tools of a common language, such as philosophy, it doesn't follow that we can't translate those claims of the disciplines into such a common language. While some metanarratives are driven by power, a philosopher might claim that the basics of logic and rationality are not. And therefore, this can serve as a basis for metanarrative discourse. Simply because the same words have different meanings or are used in different language games for different pursuits, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't, by adding those words in and making explicit the language games we're talking about, we can't reconnect these disparate threads into a single narrative if the individual small narratives are sufficiently explained. And engineer, a particle physicist, and an electrician may think of an electron in different ways using different models and different frames, but that doesn't mean they can't build back, if they build in sufficient information about their narratives into their story that they're telling about that they can't still have a conversation about the way that electrons behave. If they have sufficient explanation they're adding in. It's important to acknowledge that those implicit assumptions and those meta-narratives and those different disciplinary lenses exist, but that doesn't mean that they're completely incapable of communicating. It just means that they may need to make explicit those meta-narratives that exist. Now, the postmodernist might say that there are some meta-narratives, there are some paradigms that really are going to be completely in disagreement with each other, but that's going to be very much a particular debate around what are the individual examples that you're looking at. Additionally, one might attempt to turn Lyotard's arguments against him. The claim that there are no meta-narratives that can determine truth values in all disciplines is itself, to a certain degree, a meta-narrative about all truth-related statements. Even if Lyotard has met his burden of proof that our existing meta-narratives are problematic, it also doesn't follow that all meta-narratives will be equally problematic. Perhaps we could get to a point where these disciplines that have split off reconverge when we go through another paradigm shift and find out, you know what, under this paradigm, all of these things make sense. It doesn't make sense for them to be split off separately. Simply because some meta-narratives are unjustifiable and are simply in place due to convention or power dynamics does not mean that all necessarily will be, or that future meta-narratives could not reunite disparate disciplines. This is similar to the arguments against an academic skeptic that claims that no knowledge is possible. If no metanarratives are true, then the metanarrative that no metanarratives are true is probably false as well. Better to be a Pyrrhonian skeptic and be doubtful of all metanarratives, but not convinced that pluralistic truth is our only option, or that any metanarrative is inherently flawed, simply for trying to provide a universal description of truth. Whew. What do you think? Is there one objective truth, or are there many truths which vary because of the language games of the words we use vary by discipline? Or the paradigms vary by discipline, whatever you want to call them. The metanarratives vary by discipline. Is truth something that can be clearly, explicitly defined? Or is it something that is impossible to find? Or are the definitions that we have sufficient even if they don't meet the high standard of kind of a logical, mathematically perfect definition? Are the informal definitions that we have sufficient? Or do we need to actually step things up and expect more out of our definitions of truth and therefore meet the problem of Gödel's incompleteness and Tarski's indefinability of truth? Can we prove everything that it's true? And does it matter if we can't? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you like this video. Hit the notification bell if you want to see more like it and you want to stay up to date on this big series on postmodernism that we're doing that is actually finally getting close to the end. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org and stay skeptical, everybody.